Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome Juliet Schor to the Havens Wright Center. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on in my intro, but Juliet was actually a member of my dissertation committee at Yale, and I often tell people that she's one of the main reasons why I decided to actually be an academic. But I want to talk a little bit about her first. So she is a graduate of Wesleyan University and is an economist. So a lot of people think about Juliet as a sociologist, I think, at the Havens Center, but she's actually trained with a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Massachusetts. She's received so many professional awards from sociology, economics, and other fields over the years, but most recently was named a 2024 Honorary Fellow of the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics and as an elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Her work has been broadly supported by not only federal agencies, but also foundations such as MacArthur and Sloan Foundation, as well as Russell Sage. So Julie is an incredibly accomplished academic, but one of the reasons why I have suggested we bring her here to the Havens Center, and she's been here a couple times over her impressive career, but for this particular talk is that she has such deep expertise at the intersection of labor, climate, consumption, and well-being. So I think that the work that she's done over her career is so important, given where we are today with not only the climate crisis, but thinking about what job quality looks like and what people really want, out of life. And so I'm really excited to invite Julie here today to talk about her work. But I think it's really important to take a moment to just sort of name the fact that she's been researching work time since the 1980s. So some of you who may be a little bit older than I am, they may have read her work. The Overworked American was actually a national bestseller that came out in 1992. She's had a number of other books, some from academic presses and some from more popular presses around topics related to both work time as well as sustainable consumption. So that's one of the things that I personally think is so special about Julie's work is that she looks not only at the labor side of things, but also consumption. So she has this very integrated systems look at what an economy actually should do for people. And I think that that's really fantastic. So a couple of her other books that you can check out are After the Gig, Plenitude, Born to Buy, and The Overspent American. You can also read Julie's work and see her in a number of different media outlets because she's a very prolific public scholar. And I think that in particular, her work on the 4-day work week, there's a TED Talk that has over 3 million views at this point. So you can be 3 million and one if you would like. Lastly, I just wanted to say that on a personal note, Julie taught a course when I was a graduate student at Yale University at the environmental school there on consumption and sustainability. And she came at a time that I was definitely thinking about leaving graduate school. And it was incredibly helpful to see someone like her who's not only this incredibly rigorous academic, but who really cares about the social and environmental impact of their scholarship. So I can tell from personal experience that she was a really incredible mentor for me, as well as for a lot of other junior scholars working in this space. I still remember she created a new economics institute in the summertime she did for several years and brought so many of us there together to really engage with each other, but also to learn from more senior academics and activist scholars in the field. And so that's just, to me, one of the things that's so special about her is that she's not only this person who's doing all of this really hard-hitting scholarship, but she's really making an impact on people at the more personal level. So I'll stop waxing poetic about how much I love Julie and let her talk to you about her work. So her most recent work since 2022 has been really as the lead researcher for pathbreaking trials with hundreds of companies around the world on the 4-day work week. So many of you, I'm sure, are here today, specifically with this being May Day, to learn about her work and her upcoming book titled 4 Days a Week, which will be published by Harvard Business in June 2025. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Julie to the Havens Wright Center.
Thank you, Jen. Well, it's really fantastic to be here. On the one hand, what they call in football the coaching tree, but it's sort of the assistant coaches and so forth who we're with someone, and of course, for someone who has spent a lot of time training graduate students, the tree of the students I've had the privilege of being involved in is really important to me. And I can't think of a place that I am sort of more pleased and proud about to have someone who's in my tree associated with than the Havens Rights Center. I mean, it's just a fantastic place. And Jen, thank you so much for inviting me or suggesting to invite me. And I'm just so pleased that you are part of this incredible center. As was mentioned, I have a long history with the center. I think probably 1983 was my very first visit when I was just a brand new assistant professor. And over the years, I have had the privilege of coming back many times. And so that's really great. Really pleased to be here. So I'm going to talk today about the 4-day week and the work that I've been doing. And I think at a place like Havens Right, one of the first questions one might ask is sort of, well, this is an employer-driven innovation that you're studying. I mean, this is not coming from labor unions or workers. It's not a bottom-up necessarily. Can it really work? Is there a catch here? Or is this something that's really viable for workers? And so can an employer-driven reform be a good thing for workers? The case of the 4-day week. So one person who definitely thinks it can be a good thing for workers is Senator Bernie Sanders, who held the first hearing on the 4-day week since in 80 years. Oh, no, excuse me, since the 1950s. The 4-day week came into being 85 years ago. But in last year, just about a little over a year from ago, Senator Sanders held a hearing entitled "Workers Should Benefit from New Technology and Increased Productivity: The Need for a 32-Hour Week with No Loss in Pay." And I was privileged to be able to testify at that hearing along with the president of the UAW, Shawn Fain. So it was a historic moment. And it's Senator Sanders was planting a flag to say this is a conversation that we need to have now, because of course there has been no conversation about how many days a week we should work for a very long time. People may be surprised to know that Richard Nixon was an advocate of the 4-day week, but that was sort of that time back in the 70s was really the last time that we've been discussing it seriously in the US. I was surprised when the economics correspondent of the New York Times, Benjamin Applebaum, came out in support of the auto workers who put the demand for a 32-hour week into their contracts in their last contract negotiation. And of course, you may remember that they went on strike and they won. They won a lot. They did not win a 4-day week. They did not win a 32-hour week, but it was, again, planting a flag and saying, this is something important to us. And when President Fain talked at the hearing, one of the things he talked about was the fact that, and he said, well, American manufacturing workers are, many of them are working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, and they're forced to do that. So the issue of the ability of workers to have a life, and here, of course, on May Day, we can think about the 8-hour day and the importance of the 8-hour day. So the context, the times have changed and the context is really different. And this is one of the reasons I feel optimistic about the 4-day week. And I will come back to that question. So the media. So we talked about the government. labor unions. The media has been very, very favorable to the 4-day week. And I remember when I published the book that Jen mentioned, The Overworked American, the media was also very favorable to that idea, back in 1992 when it came out. I've always thought part of the reason is that journalists tend to be very overworked themselves. They have long hours, but we've had tremendous coverage from the business press as well as the mainstream press. CNN named us one of the 9 big risk takers for the year in 2023. Just even Wall Street Journal, why very positive, etc. And even more so, Britain has been a real center, a place that we've been doing a lot of studying, where the 4-day week has had a even broader interest take up, and not this Labor government, but the previous shadow cabinet of the Labor government, when the Tories were in power, put a 4-day week onto its party program. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of why is the 4-day week movement happening? Who's behind it? What are its impacts for workers and companies? And how likely is it to succeed? So let's start with the pandemic. The pandemic really changed everything. Here's a Google Trends stat on searches for burnout from work, because the pandemic has had an enormous impact on people. And in my view, it turned the 4-day week from something that was aspirational. So when I would talk about reduced work time, or people would talk about the 4-day week before the pandemic, it was something people that thought, oh, that would be great, but it seemed completely unrealistic. It seemed like, yeah, pie in the sky. I believe that the 4-day week, the pandemic transformed the common sense. So it turned it from an aspirational idea into something that really began to have, of course, what Gramsci called hegemony, but which became a kind of common sense. And I'll give you one example of that. The very first company that joined our trials, I was doing interviews with workers, employees at that company, and for my TED Talk. And one of them started telling me the story. She was the head of customer service, and she said when she told her biggest client that she was no longer going to be working on Fridays, the person said effectively, "You go, girl." Like, that's great. And it's interesting, we're hearing that so much from many of the companies that we have been studying, that customers are really understanding, and many of them wish that they could have it too. So widespread burnout in the United States, and this is the latest Gallup state of the world's workers, which came out just a couple of days ago with the 2024 data. This is US and Canada. They break their data down regionally. And the question is, have you experienced stress a lot of the day yesterday? And of course, you can see that big increase from 2019 to 2020 up to 52, and then 53, and then came down a bit, but not much. And it has not reverted to pre-pandemic levels. Women are even more stressed out. Younger people are more stressed out, and managers are more stressed out. So this is something that we're seeing still in the US and Canada. Asking people there, excuse me, did I miss one? Yeah, okay. Globally, you also have a lot of stress. Globally, 68 of employees are in the categories that Gallup reports as either struggling or suffering. And you can see that number again has gone up a lot with the pandemic, come down just a bit. Another global one, which is the stress levels. So 40% a lot of the day yesterday, stress. So lower than the American. And here we're back to US and Canada to get into the next dimension of this. So people are stressed out on the job. They have high levels of burnout. It's really hard for them to reconcile job and their lives outside of work. And so we're seeing really high levels of what Gallup calls intent to leave. So these are people who are currently looking for another job or watching. They're not sort of actively out there pounding the pavement, but they're basically watching. So they are in a mode where they're interested in moving, or are they not looking? And half of Americans and Canadians, as well as half of workers globally, answer that question as intent to leave. And that's again, younger people more likely to be interested in leaving. And we can see that many of these people followed up on those intent to leave. We had the tremendous increase in quits in the United States, the so-called Great Resignation, which occurred during COVID. And although those numbers have come down, they are still elevated in comparison to historical levels and high levels of vacancies. There's a little bit of funkiness with this number, but still high levels of unfilled job vacancies in the US. Now, one of the reasons that we're seeing the stress, we're seeing intent to leave, we're seeing this workplace dissatisfaction is that people are working very long hours. And this is these are annual hours across a selected group of countries in the OECD. US, of course, still an outlier in terms of very long hours. Fun fact, I guess, or not very fun for us here in the US, when I started researching and writing about work time, Japan was the workaholic country. And that one thing that happened the week my book came out was a Japanese minister said Americans were lazy. But even the Japanese now are working less and considerably less than Americans. And one of the things, if I think about sort of the places where we're seeing more 4-day week activity, they tend to be the longer hours, not completely, but Spain is a place where the 4-day week movement in some sense started. As a big movement, the Spanish government announced a trial for companies to put workers on a 4-day week, and they were going to subsidize those wages. And the UK has been, as I said earlier, been a big center. And we could talk more about that, the role of long hours in the 4-day week movement. So let me tell you about the trials that I've been involved in researching. And as my title of today's talk suggests, it is an employer-driven beginning. So there's a man named Andrew Barnes. He's actually British, but relocated to Australasia, started a company in New Zealand called Perpetual Guardian. He was on a plane one day reading through some magazines, and he saw a study that said office-based workers in the UK and Canada only work 2 to 3 hours a day. Now, to me, that's like a very apocryphal, kind of fake statistic. I really doubt it's true. But it got Andrew Barnes thinking that if the people at his company, which is a financial services company, really weren't working a full 8-hour day and they had slack in their day, well, maybe he could make a deal with them. And he called that deal the 180-100 model. He would give them 100% of their pay, and they could work 80% of the time, but they would be responsible for doing 100% of their work. So basically, he had the idea, they have slack in their work schedule. Let's compress their work into 4 days. And so he started a trial. It was extremely successful. He had a local researcher, do some sort of retrospective surveying on it. And he came away with the idea that this is possible to do, and that it's now we have a movement for shorter hours that could actually benefit companies as well as employees. And he started with his partner, Charlotte Lockhart, started an NGO called 4-Day Week Global. And they joined forces with someone who was doing trials in Ireland, and they collaborated and began this series of trials. To participate in a trial, a company had to maintain pay at 100%. They had to promise a meaningful reduction in hours. The vast majority did the 8-hour reduction, but a few did a little bit less. And the other thing was for most of these companies, although not all, and I can get into this, there was the expectation that they wouldn't be reducing their productivity. And that's how they were going to continue to pay 100%. And the way they would do that was through what the organization calls work reorganization, in which they would spend 2 months of coaching and onboarding before the new schedule kicks in, and they'd figure out where they're wasting time. And they would do this together. These companies would go through this process together, along with staffers from 4-Day Week Global, to help them figure out some common time wasting things, like meetings are too long. There are too many meetings. They're inefficient meetings. People are distracted too much. A whole series of things to help companies to figure out how they could save time and actually get as much done in a shorter period of time. They asked me to be the lead researcher for these trials, and we began our first trial in February of 2022. It was a combination of that original Ireland trial that I'd already been working on with some US companies. And then we began every 2 months through 2022 to add a new region of the world. So then we added US and Canada, UK, Australasia. We came back around to the US and Canada in the fall. We did a mixed European and North American trial at the beginning of 2023, then South Africa with a few French companies. The Portuguese government sponsored a trial in June of 2023. We did another US, Canada, a German trial. There are also Brazilian trials, and some of these places are going back for seconds. We're collaborating with researchers in Sweden and Norway doing another trial, and there's Belgium. And so there's trial activity going on all around. We also did a Scottish trial sponsored by the Scottish government. This is my team. My colleague Wen Fan, who's a specialist in health and well-being and work from home, remote work, and 2 of our graduate students. And we started out without any funding because it was all happening so fast, but we were able to get National Science Foundation and Russell Sage Foundation funding, and we are still collecting data. So let me just say something about what some of the theories of work and labor think about something like this, an intervention like this. So I would say there's a skeptical view from neoclassical economics, and it can be maybe summed up in the idea there are no $20 bills lying on the sidewalk. This is a sort of famous economist's, partly a joke, but 2 economists walking along, and one of them sees some money on the ground and says to the other one, "Hey, look, there's a $20 bill there." And the second person says, "No, that's not possible. It would have been picked up already." So it's a sort of famous economist thing, meaning there are no such thing as a free lunch. That is, the economy is efficient. All the free lunches have already been gotten, and therefore we're already at the right levels of work time, and workers choose their hours. This was a big theme that I criticized in the Overworked American. They choose their hours, and the company doesn't really care that much how much workers work or when they work, as long as workers will only get their productivity. So if they're working fewer hours, that they're less productive, they'll be paid less. And that's the source of the firm's indifference. And so the idea that we sort of have this, big inefficiency, that people are working 5 days, but they could go to 4 and they'd be just as productive, very, very unexpected. very skeptical response from many economists who don't think there is that free lunch there or that $20 bill. And if you do get the productivity improvements, they're not expected, but therefore, they'll be minor, they'll go away. And if workers want a 4-day week, they're probably going to have to take lower wages to get them. So that's kind of the neoclassical economics, skeptical of this whole endeavor. Now, at a place like the Havens Rights Center, you'll also be, there'll be lots of conversation about a different view of what's going on in the workplace. And that is a view that labor and capital are duking it out, and it's a power struggle. And much of this kind of theorizing goes under the terminology of labor process theories or Marxian labor process theories. Of course, Harry Braverman's famous Labor and Monopoly Capital, which is the story of that control, that idea that the company wants to control things and increasingly has been able to. So in a labor process theory, an employer-driven work time reduction, which is what's really happening in the companies we're studying, is very, very unlikely. And the story of how workers got shorter work time over, many decades, and from the 19th century through the 20th century was that they organized, was that they formed unions and they fought the bosses tooth and nail to get reductions in work time. And of course, Marx has his very famous chapter 10 of Capital on the working day, which is all about those struggles over work time and the ways in which companies eked more work out of workers. And that was the story that I told in the Overworked American, which is the bias that companies have for long hours and their resistance to shorter hours of work. So from the point of view of the Overworked American, an employer-driven innovation, such as the one I'm currently studying, is also pretty unlikely. Productivity improvements in this story are likely to lead the 4-day week to be temporary. So if that work reorganization does yield productivity improvements, in these theories, the company is probably going to want to keep those productivity improvements and then go back to 5 days. And that's exactly what the head of the TED Talk said to me when I did my rehearsal. He was, again, skeptical like many of the neoclassical economists. And he said, well, if there are those productivity gains that are there, why doesn't the company make them happen on a 5-day schedule? So in this theory, these innovations, this 4-day week that we're talking about is likely to have a kind of blowback impact on workers. So maybe it's that they end up back at 5 days, but working harder and faster, having to give more to the firm. So it's like, there's got to be a catch here. Sounds too good to be true. But there is one variant of sort of Marxian, and I'll call it neo-Marxian labor theory, and it's the one I was trained in. And I've put, this is a picture of a man named Sam Bowles, an economist. I mention him because he was also a great friend of the Havens Rights Center, a very dear, long-term, very close friend of Eric Rout's. And my dissertation was written at the time that he and we were developing a theory which was asked the question, well, we know Marx emphasized the difficulty of extracting labor from labor power, and that's what that fight, that control was about, that the labor process theories talked about. But how do they do that? And one of the ways they do that, we argued, was that the company, the employer, will raise the wage a little bit to make the job more valuable to the worker, make it better than the other jobs that are out there. And so the idea is that there is a cost to workers of losing their job because the job that they have is more valuable than the other jobs that are available. And so it's a kind of job, it's an argument about, number one, why jobs are scarce, because wages go above the market clearing wage. but also that to get workers to work, companies need to make the job somewhat valuable. Well, my analysis at the beginning about the pandemic, about how the pandemic stressed people out and it led them to want to leave and so forth, can be sort of thought about in these terms, which is that the pandemic reduced the value of the job and therefore reduced the cost of job loss to the worker, which is a big reason why people started quitting in droves. The 4-day week as a response to that is expected because the firm is going to have to do something to keep its workers on the job and also to keep them valuing the job. And what our research shows is that the 4-day week, it wasn't a wage increase, but it was something, I mean, it's an hourly wage increase, of course. You're now getting your full pay for 4 days, 32 hours rather than 40 hours. So it's an hourly wage increase. But it's expected in part because it represents a large increase in the value of the job at a time when the value of the job had gone down a lot, according to all these other things that I was just showing you. All right, so let me show you what we found. We've collected a lot of data. We collect data from the employers and from the employees. We have a before and after methodology. So we survey them before the trial starts, while they're still on a 5-day week. Then at 3 months and at 6 months, 6 months, 12 months, we've even done 24-month surveys. We have a time diary to find out what they're doing on their day off. And we've done interviews with lots of different kinds of people. So I'm going to start with our employee findings. So the first thing is that for employees, the trials are amazing. They love them. They say they are life-changing. They are, the best thing that ever happened to me, etc. People go from being stressed out and burned out to really having so much better life. They're getting off their anxiety meds. They're finding that they can get pregnant. They're having time to go to see the doctor. We have one wonderful case of a man who said he wouldn't have gone to the doctor if he were still on the 5-day schedule. Thank God he did, because he got catching an early cancer diagnosis, and he might be dead if he hadn't. I mean, so you're hearing all of these kinds of stories, as well as just the garden variety. Life is so much better. So we have 20 measures of well-being, and I'll quickly show you the other ones, but these are 5 that we focused a lot on. I'm going to show you some more detailed results. So from baseline to endpoint, burnout, it's a 7-item scale. It's the Copenhagen burnout scale, goes down by almost half a point. These are the number of people in each of the number of people had a decrease and an increase. So 68% of people had a decrease in their burnout. You might say, hey, wait, what happened? 23% of people had an increase. Well, why didn't everybody have a decrease? Remember, we're just measuring from beginning to end. We don't know about all the other things that are happening to people. So I remember reading one survey of a man I was about to interview, and I saw that his stress went up, his sleep went down, his exercise went down, his anxiety and fatigue went up. And I'm thinking, I bet he had a kid. And sure enough, he'd become a father. And so there are lots of things happening to people. They might have taken on a more stressful position. They might have gotten sick. Someone in their life might have gotten sick. They might have broken up with their partner. So there are lots of reasons why people might feel worse at the end. But look at the big differences there. And on the average, you've got improvements in everything: job satisfaction, mental health, physical health, positive emotions. Every one of them statistically significant. And here are all the others: positive emotions, negative, work-family balance, work-life balance, work-to-family conflict, etc., and satisfaction with house and finances, relationship, time. That one, of course, not surprisingly, goes up the most. Fatigue, fewer sleep problems, more sleep time, more exercise. So on all of these, improvements. So what is it that's causing the improvements? Well, with those 5 that I started with, we started to do some modeling. And the first thing we did was we looked at the hours reduction. So yeah, the company's going down to 40 to 4 days a week, and it's a 32-hour week. But, there are plenty of people who are going to maybe work a little on the off day, or maybe they have really long hours, or let's see what really happened to their hours. So we ask the individuals about the changes in their hours. And the first thing we find is that the more people reduce their hours, the more improvement they see in these measures. And you can see that by the people who reduced a little bit. It's the size of these coefficients here. So the people who reduced a little bit, let's take burnout. That coefficient is 131. But the people who reduced 8 hours or more, it's more than twice that, 294. And you see that roughly the same, although not to the same magnitude with these others. Physical health, for example, is something that we think would be less affected than, say, burnout or mood, like positive affect. Well, then we wanted to ask one more question. I'm going to go fast through this. I can come back in the Q&A. It gets a little wonky, but what is it about an hour's reduction that leads to greater well-being? And so we do an analysis of the other things that are changing to see that how work hours is changing other things. And at the top of this slide, you can see total direct and indirect effects. So the total effect is the total effect of hours. The direct effect is just what we can't explain in other ways. The indirect effect is moving through these other variables. What are they? Two main categories. One is these, what we call health behaviors. So sleep, fatigue, and exercise frequency. And those matter a lot. And they matter at the individual level. They matter, they are about half of the explanation. And the other half of the explanation is that people feel much more productive. So that's what Andrew Barnes said was going to happen. It is a self-report, but it's a big increase in what we measured. In one way we measured it was what we call workability. It's an existing item on a lot of workplace surveys. How would you rate your current workability compared to your lifetime best? And that goes up a lot, goes up by a whole point on average in these trials. And then we also asked other ways of, your efficiency. I think we asked about productivity. You'll see those in a minute. But the point is that people feel more productive at work, and they're engaging in a lot more positive health behaviors outside of work. And that's why shorter work hours matter so much. So one of the things you might ask, to get back to that question I asked of, well, is this really like a good thing for workers, or is it maybe, is it something that companies are doing that's going to have negative impacts on workers, is the question of speed up. And the model, the 180-100 model, says they're doing smart working, right? We're getting more efficient. We're reorganizing work in ways that get rid of the wasted time. And so that should just be a benefit for workers, because they don't have to sit in those boring meetings, or they're not getting distracted all the time. But it could also be that they're just getting sped up. And I was pretty sure they were going to get sped up, like the whole 180-100. I was a little bit skeptical of it to begin with. So we wanted to ask questions about, well, what's your pace of work? What's your workload? What's your work intensity before the trial starts to now? And the first thing that we found is hardly any change at all. So if you look at those first three, pace, workload, work intensity, no significant, a little bit of work intensity maybe, but not at a very high statistical level. That's what that plus means, that it's not, doesn't have all those asterisks like the stuff that really changed. And you can look and see that the number that increased and decreased wasn't all that different. So it doesn't seem to be mostly a speed up. There's really not that much speed up going on. Instead, what we see is this big increase in productivity at work when we just ask people how productive they are, that current workability. And also a third thing, which is a 5-item scale called the Work Smart scale, which has various aspects of people basically being efficient. And we see an increase in that as well. Half of the people on all of these productivity measures say they have an increase. So I don't think it's mostly a speed up. We also asked about other things that we thought might be, sort of unintended consequences, like were people just taking on second jobs? And the answer to that is no. And even second job holding goes down even a little bit. So we weren't seeing anything, a negative from the point of view of the workers. And I remember we have open-ended comments in our survey. And I remember one of them where a person was just complaining and oh, this is terrible. I have too much work to get it done in 4, and nobody's talking to each other, all the sort of negative things you could think of. And then at the end it says, but boy, this is so much better than the 5-day week. So although there are some things about it that may be difficult, and some of the companies I've talked to, they will stress this is not that easy. It's not magic, but if you can do it, which the vast majority have, and I'll show you that in a minute, it's really worthwhile. Well, the other thing is sort of how much do the workers value it? And we ask a question which says, which do you prefer, the 5 or the 4-day week? And the 96% say they prefer the 4-day week. And then we ask them, well, if you were to be going to another job and it was a 5-day week, how much, what kind of salary adjustment, if any, would you require to to go back to a 5-day week? So you can see here that for 6%, they don't need that much extra, 10% or less. And then you've got about 40% who say they're going to want between a 10 and a 25% increase. And then you have another 32%, they're going to want between 26 and a 50% increase in salary to go back to 5 days. You have almost 10% say, I'm going to need a 50% increase. And then you have this very consistent across all the trials, 14% or, 13 to 14%. No amount of money could ever induce me to go back to a 5-day week. So what you see here is a high value that workers are putting on this schedule. And this is what raised that cost of job loss to them, because to take another job, they require so much more money because the value of the job has gone up so much. And that's where that neo-Marxian story that I was talking about seems to be really borne out in our results. Okay, and we could talk about all of this more. What about the companies? So we have much less good data from the companies. Many of the companies are small. I haven't gotten into the details of the companies. I'll tell you a few things about them. They are overwhelmingly white collar, and they are overwhelmingly small, although we do have some big ones. We have a 5,000 person company that started with 1,000 of its workers and then is expanding to all of them. We have a sort of good number in the 100 and up, but it's partly an artifact of the trial. If you're a big company, you wouldn't need to join a little NGO trial like this. We do have manufacturing, we have restaurants, we have healthcare. We pretty much have lots of sectors, but we are very heavily disproportionate in professional services, in tech, finance. We have banks, financial institutions, we have architects, lawyers, and you name it. And you may ask, well, how do the lawyers do it? The billable hours, folks, they figure it out. And the vast majority of these companies have a very favorable view of the trial. So overall, they rated at an 8.5 on a scale of 1 to 10. On productivity and performance, they rated at an 8.5. And there's one more I didn't put in here. On ability to attract new talent, new workers, they rated, I think, an 8.2. So because so many are small, we don't have a lot of consistent, really hard data on like profits or revenues. We collected that stuff and it looks good, but only about half of the companies were able to get or gave it to us. So we decided to figure out how it works for the companies, probably in some ways the most complete measure would be, did they keep 4-day week? Because if it wasn't working, they would revert back. And they, these are trials that they're getting involved in, 6-month trials. So we took 203 companies that had started the trial between the beginning of our research in June of 2023. 6 didn't tell us about their trial status. The South African trial was not as robust, and we had a number of them dropped out. That 7 is the majority of those, I think, came from South Africa. They never really did it. So 6 we don't know. 7 dropped out before completing. And then after completing the 6-month trial, 8 decided to stop and go back at 6 months. And then at 1 year, 5 more stopped at some point. And so 177 were still on a 4-day week. And so that's overall about a 10% are discontinuing. And if you take the few who never really did it, it's only about half that number. So the vast majority are found that were successful with the trial and have kept on. And the vast majority of those have kept on, much longer than 1 year, but that's what we've studied. A little bit about, so you see here that the South Africa group was much, these are discontinue rates by the companies. So South Africa tended to discontinue a lot more. There was some big economic downturn in Australasia at the time of the trial. UK, Ireland, US, Canada, this is the biggest group, and they have much lower discontinue rates. And there are some differences. Some of the very small ones are more likely to drop out, in part because they're so small. I mean, some of these are like 5-person companies. IT is a little bit more likely, and some of this other, there's a couple of very small retail outlets. That's part of why this is higher. And the for-profits are a little bit more likely than the nonprofits. So then we wanted to see, okay, so can we develop a model to predict discontinuation? So none of those, you saw those differences here on this chart, but most of these are not statistically significant. So when you put it into a model, it's a little bit hard to do a model like this. It's called a rare events model because so few are discontinuing or failing. But what you can see here is there are a couple of things that seem to matter. So the age of the workers doesn't matter. We were thinking maybe the companies with younger workers would stick with it more. That wasn't true. And the productivity increase for this workability didn't really matter. We thought that might matter if we were testing that labor process theory, which suggested that maybe that companies will get the productivity increase and then just go back up. There's a little bit of evidence for that on the work smart. So it may be that you have some of those companies doing what that theory said they would. But the other 2 things that really matter are if a company doesn't get the well-being impacts, and there aren't many that don't, but there are a few, if their stress levels don't go down for their workers or the burnout, et cetera, they're more likely to discontinue the trial. And there's one more that we could talk about. This is a complicated one. The more white men in the workforce, as measured by the surveys that we have, because not 100% of people do the surveys. It's a high percentage, like 78%. But the companies with more white men are more likely to discontinue. And that goes along with a lot of sociological evidence about sort of workaholism and what is called male contest cultures and so forth, the idea of like men as the hard workers. And so we see a little bit of evidence for that here. So let me wrap up. How did we get to the 4-day week? And this brings us back to the question that I used for the title, which is an employer-driven innovation really going to be good for workers? Well, the interesting thing about the 5-day week is, although the story of it, if you ask the narrative, how do we get to the 4-day week? You're going to get this. And this is a famous, these are bumper stickers. Organized labor takes credit for the 5-day week. The folks who brought you the weekend. That's what I thought had happened. I was a colleague who's doing a book on the 7-day week, shared a lot of great information with me, in which I learned that actually, no, the 5-day week movement was started by Jewish garment companies, and they wanted the Sabbath to worship, and there was a rabbis movement that had gotten active because the Reform Jews were starting to move to a Sunday worship because everyone was working 6 days. And in fact, it turns out that the very first company to go to a 5-day week was owned by a family that lives, very close to my house. And they're a famous family, the Feuersteins. They owned a company called Malden Mills, and they invented Polar Tech, and their mill burned down, and they decided, instead of going overseas like every other garment company was doing, to rebuild their site, which they did, and give those workers their jobs. So Jewish garment workers, also small companies like we're seeing today, were the beginning of the 5-day week movement. 1920, you start to get more and more companies trying this. Wyatt paid us to adopt the 5-day week. And they're saying the same exact things that we're hearing from employers today, which are, half of them at least were saying, we've made up all the work and it's working for us. And here we're sort of moving out from garment to also printing. And then we get a big construction workers union and so forth. But this is Factory, the magazine of management. So this is like the Chamber of Commerce point of view. And they're saying the 5-day week is really good for companies. And if you read these articles, they sound almost identical to Andrew Barnes, the founder of the 4-day week Global. Then, of course, you get Henry Ford, the first really big employer to do this. Ford announces in 1922, but they don't actually get around to doing it until 1926. And then things start to change. But at the beginning, organized labor was against this because they thought it would reduce wages. And so it's not until much later, until the end of the decade, that you start to get organized labor coming on board, starting with the Amalgamated, which is the male textile workers union. And then, of course, you have the Depression, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the fight first for a 30-hour week, which in the end fails because Roosevelt pulls out of supporting it, and you get a 40-hour 5-day week in the Fair Labor Standards Act, starting in 1938 when the act is passed with a 44-hour week, and then by 1940 it goes down to 40. So it's uncanny how today's movement is unfolding just like the movement for a 5-day week. I am optimistic about the future of the 4-day week because I'm seeing a lot of activity in places. Spain is about to reduce their statutory week below 40. Portugal and Scotland have both had government-sponsored trials. The UAE has done work time reduction already officially. Belgium has a trial. The city of Tokyo has gone to a 4-day week for its employees. We have 20 US states which has had some kind of activity. None of these bills have passed yet. In Wisconsin, your health department gave funding for a senior residence called the Capri Communities to put a lot of their staff onto a 4-day week. And we have movement at the local level with public sector workers. I just had a meeting with someone in the state of Washington. Their county has gone to a 4-day week. So there's activity. if we have a recession, of course, things could really change. But for now, I would say, it's been it's a movement that is gaining momentum. All right, let me stop there. Thank you all very much. And let's take questions.
So first, Julie, there is a question from Alistair, who is in the UK. And he notes that the UK has moved from a 40-hour week to a 35-hour week. Do you think, let's see, he had asked, does this lead to similar outcomes for workers? Are they connected? There was another,
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the UK, our findings are identical for the UK to all the other countries. In fact, there's some weird stuff in the sense, I mean, not weird, but there's I'd say interesting. I mean, as a researcher, super interesting that the findings really don't differ much across these countries. So they don't differ across the countries. They don't differ across the industries. The well-being findings, for example, and they don't differ across different kinds of people in the workforce. That really surprised us. I mean, we thought, well, women will benefit more from this, or and if you just look at the raw numbers, it looks a little bit like they do on some of these, but for the most part, once you put them into the model and control for things, we're not finding differences. So the same for the UK. I mean, they had really good results, but not statistically significantly different than any other of the countries.
Okay, the next question comes, thank you for that. The next question comes from Jay, who asked an interesting question. Do companies that convert to the 4-day work week and remove slack, or to at least, I suppose that also means maintain their efficiency and productivity, find that slack, in fact, does creep back in? Is slack in the labor process useful? How are companies managing that?
Yeah, it is a great question. And we haven't explicitly asked it. I would say the closest that I've come to having a sense of it is talking to managers and CEOs and so forth sometime afterwards. Because I did interview, for my book, I did interviews of CEOs or the person who led the 4-day week and so forth. And nobody mentioned that. So I think that, I mean, one of the things is, and I think you can see it from those data that I showed on speed up and intensity and so forth. The intensity doesn't go up by that much. I mean, if it had, you might expect it to go back down. But really, they put in place just different, for many of them, they stopped doing a lot of time wasting things that they were doing. So they're not really speeding people up and losing much slack.
Okay.
And I think that's probably why I'm not hearing about that. That said, it's a really great question. I mean, I sort of, I would say my intuition would be that would probably happen. People would, be more efficient and work smarter and all of that, and over time. But, we've got another thing going on too, and I didn't talk about this at all in the presentation, but of course we have AI coming in, and particularly since so many of these people are in professional services, these are the kinds of jobs where they might be using generative AI. And so, and that is the next focus that we're trying to raise some funding now to go back to these companies and find out about that. But it's also a really important point about the long-term sort of trajectory for work time reduction. I'll put it out here because I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but it's been at the core of my work on work for, forever. Which is, that the idea that the way to get work time reduction is by trading income for time. So when you get productivity growth, instead of just producing more and giving people more income, I mean, I know these days workers don't get that income, but producing more and creating more income wherever it goes, you decide to reduce work hours. And so you produce the same amount in less time, or you do both, a little bit of increase and a little bit of work time reduction. So that's always been my view of how to accomplish work time reduction. With AI coming in and expected, expected increases in productivity, that becomes even more important, right? Because otherwise you're going to be laying people off. And if AI is as big as many people think it will be, I mean, I don't think it will be as big as some people think, but it can have some really employment disrupting impacts. And so you're really going to need to reduce working hours along with it. But to get back to the original question, the slack, when you're introducing new technologies, you may not see the slack because and that's always happening. You're always in the process of, presumably improving your productivity.
Great. Thank you. That was great. Eric Kaziak asks, if a big selling point for the companies is reduce costs to workers leave it, to reduce costs related to search is what I believe he's talking about, and replacement, since workers value their jobs more and don't want to go back to a 5-day schedule, will some of that value go away if this is widely adopted and it becomes the status quo? So exactly, once it becomes ubiquitous, is it, how sticky is it?
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, this is a really important point. It's only a competitive advantage in the labor market if it's not widely available. And so the firms that are getting this now are getting it, but if it spreads, then it's not going to be something which affects whether or not people apply to jobs or stay in them, right? So that part of what's happening, well, no, I should take it back. There are two parts to people taking jobs and staying in jobs. One is the sort of their evaluation of this opportunity relative to others. And so, it's a really great point by the questioner, really important, that it is what you might call a first mover, an early mover advantage in the market that goes away as it spreads. Right now, it's huge. It's really huge. I think we'll see that for quite some time, but of course it dissipates as that grows. The reason I put a caveat on that is that there are the other reasons that people will either agree to work or leave work has to do with just that burnout factor and so forth. So what we're seeing, there's a second kind of firm. As I mentioned earlier, I was never a huge fan of the 100-80-100 idea. Probably, because of my own training as a quote unquote Marxist economist in labor stuff, and the idea that somehow this is going to be some great gift from the employers and so forth. And one of the things I was seeing from some firms was that they were 180-80s, I call them. 100% of the pay, 80% of the work. You don't have to make it up. It's just 4 days. That's it. Who were those companies? And I'm sorry, I've gotten a little blurry here. Who were those companies? Healthcare, where people are burning out like crazy. They're losing nurses. Restaurants, where they're losing their chefs because they're working these long hours. And in those companies, they're just like nonprofits where people were emotionally burned out. They're just saying 4 days, that's it. And they're not reorganizing. They're not doing anything. They're hiring some new people, or they're changing their division of labor. And they're just giving people a rest. Why? Because they were demanding too much from them. 100% was not a viable schedule because their work intensity is so high. And so I call it the paradox of work intensity, because the companies for whom it's working now what we're seeing is low intensity companies, the ones that Andrew Barnes thought everybody was, and that his company was, where you can compress everything into 4 days, and high intensity companies where 5 days is too much. And so it's a kind of cool paradox that you've got both of those are benefiting and succeeding with a 4-day week.
Mm, mm. The floor is now open for additional questions, so please don't be shy. I want to make sure, before calling on people who have asked questions prior, I want to make sure to open it up to anyone who hasn't asked a question, to our previous question posers, just a heads up. Julie, my question would be just simply going back. I mean, it's so interesting. You have anticipated lots of the questions we would have already had. But going back to your point about labor-saving technologies like AI, of course, I am curious, you keep referencing there were reorganizations to work process as part of the trials with these employers. And I'm curious, did they, was there any labor sloughing at all? So did they find that they did, I am taken by Harry Braverman, number one, but by the labor process literature in general. And I am very suspicious that employers won't save on a labor cost if they can take advantage of that opportunity. And so I'm curious, so far in your studies, have you found any labor saving at all, or did all of the firms that you all have studied maintain their same level of staffing even through these experiments?
So there are, so we did ask a question about layoffs, I think, and whether or not it had an impact on discontinuation. There were not that many. We might have, I think more common was actually hiring, because we have a lot of startups and rapidly growing firms. We did have one that we did sort of interviews at. So we had a subset of firms that we did in-depth interviews with people, and one of them was a startup in Canada who did have a sort of crisis and layoffs at some point. So there are a few, I think, but we haven't heard. More likely they're adding staff. And there are two reasons they're adding. One is because they're growing, and sometimes that growth is just so rapid they were having trouble managing everything. And then the other is with some of them, they realized they had to do a little more hiring. Those are more because they couldn't get 5 days in 4 in some of their divisions or some of the things. So in the restaurant, the 180 hundreds, in the restaurant, for example, they did some additional hiring. Kickstarter, which was our lead company, it's a tech company. They hired some extra people in their customer service because they wanted to make sure, that they could service their customers and so forth. So yeah, we're not hearing about that. I don't think there's much of that going on. But the other thing is also there wasn't as much new hiring as we had expected, in part because people aren't leaving. The resignation rates go to zero, basically, in a lot of these companies. Or I don't know, that's anecdotally, I've got stories of resignations going to zero. And I have one really great, we'll see if there are more questions, or I have one really great story. And in the book, I do vignettes of some of the companies that I learned a lot about, of a company that was monetizing the fact that people weren't leaving anymore, which is a whole interesting context. But let's see, I don't know if there are other questions.
Wonderful.
Jen,
yes, Jen does have a question. If you can read it yourself, or I'll read it out for the audience. The data on health impacts was very compelling. Can you talk more about any climate impacts of the 4-day work week that your study investigated? Given the work spend cycle you've written about, I'm also curious if workers on the 4-day trial reported any reduction in consumer expenditures. I did see the energy call out on one of your slides, so this is a really interesting question. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah. This is really, yeah, it's actually something that we are working on. So we got a small grant to do a sort of deep dive on this. So in the original surveying, we had questions on energy use, commuting, environmental behavior, and so forth. And we also were trying to get energy data from the companies because we wanted to see what's happening. Like the companies are closing, and so they have less energy use, heating, cooling, electricity. But people now they're at home, or maybe are they going on a trip? Are they going on a 3-day, jaunt on a cheap European airline, or what's happening? And the energy data was just too messy to figure out. Too much stuff was happening. Energy prices were changing. We're dealing with so many different countries. And we also have 6-month trials, which means that we're starting in winter and ending in summer, or, seasonality, a mess. So we got some very small findings. We didn't find a travel rebound, which is one of the big things we were worried about. We asked about, trips. How many have you taken in the last month? And then by the time that we got a lot of data, we didn't have to worry about seasonality because trials are taking place all the time. So doesn't look like a travel rebound at all. We did not get the amount of commuting impact that we had expected. So if you look at other studies, there are a few of 5 to 4 day weeks, typically a compressed week where people are working 4 10-hour days. They get about a 14% reduction in commuting emissions. And our problem was we started in the pandemic when so many people were at home. We have 25% of our companies are full-time remote anyway, so there's no commuting at all. We only have something like 5% who are in-person companies, like our brewery, our restaurant, we have a manufacturing, an auto manufacturer. Most are hybrid. And what's happening over the trials of the time period is people are coming back into the office more and more. So we didn't see much of a little bit of a commute improvement, but not nearly the amount of commuting, emissions reduction that we had expected. So we wanted to do better on the climate stuff because there's long been an argument that a 4-day week is really good for the climate. It reduces emissions. Of course, I have published many papers on the relationship between working hours and emissions at a macro level, showing lower hours of work annually are related to lower emissions. So we started by doing interviews with people who went to the 4-day week. There's a lot of stuff they didn't seem to change, or at least in talking about it, we're not seeing a lot of change. And then but based on the interviews, we created a much bigger, a 50-item survey to go along with the health stuff and the well-being. And we are fielding that as we speak. We're about to get our endpoint results from most of them. And actually on Monday, I'm going to get the first results. So Jen, we can email about this, but so we don't know. We don't know if we're going to see much. And I just had a meeting this morning. We're working on another proposal to try and do a better job of looking at particularly the mobility impacts. We think that's where the change is going to be. Because, Jen, the thing about the work spent cycle is when they go to 4 days, they still have as much money as on the 5-day. And so we didn't really expect to see much change in expenditures. We do ask about food, and whether in the survey comments, people say they're cooking more, but where we're actually asking about the amount of time they're spending cooking, that doesn't seem to be changing. So we're not, and we asked about expenditures in the interviews and haven't seen much on that. So we're going to focus on the transportation behavior, thinking that that's where we may see some bigger changes. Long-winded answer, no.
No, that was great. That was great. We have a question from Jana who asks, For those firms that are hiring new workers, are those new workers being hired in the same tier and with the same, we can call it a work contract to the extent that those exist, as other employees are? Is there any segmentation happening at the firms that you're looking at?
Yeah, so far as we don't have explicit questions on that, but what I've heard is sometimes what will happen. So this was the case at Kickstarter, for example. They were 100 firm mostly. I mean, they did hire some new people, but the idea was that people would figure out, okay, what is your baseline of 5 days a week? And then can you figure out how to do it in 4? And so when they hire people on, they want, if it wasn't clear what the baseline should be, I mean, some of the divisions that might be very clear, where it's much more quantifiable or work. But they might say, all right, why don't you start at 5 days, for a couple months to figure out what your 5 day is, and then you go to 4. We haven't heard anything about people having to start at 5 with the idea that they're staying at 5 or anything like that. Actually, the one thing that was really cool that we've heard a lot of companies did is if they already had people on 4-day schedules who were getting paid 80%, they would bump them up to 100%. So, yeah. But one of the things I should say here is that a lot of these companies, they have the management are kind of humane management. They sort of pride themselves on that. Not all of them. I mean, that 1,000-person company, not that 5,000-person company that I talked about, that's a UK company, not at all. They kind of did this in a sort of not humane way. It was like, you have to earn it. And there was another company, one of the ones that failed, and I interviewed, failed meaning they reverted. They only did it with a few employees, but they were like so focused on, this is such a privilege, you have to earn this, and are you going to earn it this week or not? Kind of very begrudging way to do it. And but a lot of them are just like really nice employers who care about their employee well-being. And that's a big part of why they've done this, because they saw their employees were struggling. And many of them read about these trials and this evidence and thought, well, okay, I think we can get the productivity and people will be so much better off. And in fact, one of the I think important things that another way the pandemic mattered was I had like CEOs and so forth say things to me like, the pandemic taught us that we could trust where our workers are working because of work from home. And that's why we felt okay to go to the 4-day week. Or one company that I profile in the book, they said, the founder said, I never thought work from home could work, but it's been great. So maybe this will too.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Pete, if you would like to go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks very much. First, thanks for a really great talk. I really enjoyed that. Because you're at the Havens Wright Center, I thought I'd ask you a quick question from the perspective of class analysis, and particularly from Eric Wright's work. So drawing on the work of John Goldthorpe in the UK, I remember Eric Wright observed that professional and managerial jobs are relatively difficult to supervise. So employers of relatively autonomous workers offer salaried employment contracts rather than paying by the hour. And, Eric described these as privileged appropriation locations that were able to negotiate an extra portion of the social surplus, the mechanism being a sort of loyalty rent. It strikes me that the 4-day week is in some ways a logical extension of this contract type, if you pursue it to its sort of logical conclusion, based on these kinds of mechanisms, especially for employers who, as you say, want to offer a competitive advantage in the labour market. But if that's true, and this continues to be a reform implemented by companies from above, does this model potentially risk reinforcing labour market segregation between white-collar professionals and other workers in more tightly supervised roles. And not only manufacturing, but also, for example, I know precarious workers in the platform economy, for example, who are, they're very, who are easier to supervise, and there are very serious negative sanctions implemented against them. So basically, because of the different incentive structures of these types of jobs, from the perspective of the left, we're already seeing working class disunity, with workers in manufacturing increasingly in the global north, increasingly likely to vote for parties of the populist right. So could an unintended consequence of this scheme, because of the voluntary implementation that you're talking about, be increasing resentment between an old working class, blue collar working class positions and young liberal professionals, which are traditionally the two core blocks of social democracy?
Yeah, oh, it's a great question, and it is one that I've thought about. Of course, it's possible. I don't think that's the direction we're going to go, for the following reason. I think this is happening because it's a period of stronger labor, and that is that's going across the board. That's for the white collar and the blue collar. I mean, yes, you could say manufacturing workers are voting, for right-wing parties, but we're also seeing a big surge of labor union organizing. I mean, the UAW winning that strike is massive. The fight for 15 and all of that. And many of these, if you look at the Great Resignation and so forth, those were a lot of lower wage workers. And so I think that and a lot of the white collar work now is degraded. So, to get back to Braverman. So I actually think that the fate is they're going to move together. And so if workers, if you continue, and these labor markets are integrated, they're not totally separate. At every stage you have some integration there. So I think what you're going to see is rising and falling together in terms of hours of work. That said, I mean, the platform sector that's a whole other story. I mean, I've spent 15 years studying platform workers, and to me, one of the most interesting things about the platform workers is that the companies gave up control over hours of work and scheduling. But so it's very hard to think about how this could work for platform workers because they're not on regular schedules and so on and so forth. And that's a whole complicated thing. And what's going to happen in those firms also, because, one of the things about a lot of those platforms is that they've been massive money losers. So they don't really have a viable model yet. I know Uber made its first so-called profit, but it was teensy, and it's one anyway. So, but it's a really great question. It's something to keep an eye on. I mean, the other thing is, I know we have to go, that the sort of the bifurcation, not just along blue and white collar, but maybe into 5-day and 4-day week firms, where the 5-day week firms pay more. That I think is maybe more likely.